Jakkie Cilliers is the founder of the Institute of Security Studies. He's also the author of a 2017 book called Fate of the Nation. If you haven't read it, here it is. That's what it looks like. Brilliant, brilliant book, which has stood the test of time, Jakkie. Let's just start, though, with the three scenarios. It was Fate of the Nation, three scenarios for South Africa's future. You had scenario Bafana, not a good one, Nation Divided, and Mandela Magic. If you were to write the book today and you were to look at those scenarios, would there be a heck of a lot of difference given that it's 5 years later?
Alec, the scenarios have stood the test of time. And I have in actual fact in the subsequent years been updating that quite regularly. Let me first say that the major finding stands very well, which is the major challenge that faces the ANC, which was even in that time steadily losing support, becoming an increasingly rural party, and facing a challenge in particular urban areas, and that structural decline has not shifted. So in the most recent updates, about a year ago, I started with two sets of broad scenarios. The one was where Ramaphosa stays on as president, as I expect him to do in a few days' time and in 2024. And that gives you the Bafana muddling along scenario. I also had a Tumamina scenario, which is where Ramaphosa gains a resounding victory. His faction dominates within the NEC and then subsequently in cabinet. So the ANC does quite well in that scenario. The second set of scenarios related to where Ramaphosa was forced to step aside as the RET faction have been pushing him. That gave rise to two scenarios. The one was Mandela Magic, which is really where the ANC, in a sense, implodes and you find a more rapid move towards coalition government, possibly even by 2024. And then the other was Nation Divided, which was where Ramaphosa does not stand. Somebody like Lindiwe Sisulu or an RET faction member takes over, and the ANC support plummets, and the party struggles. So I've been working on that, been updating that, but I still think that there's what we refer to as the base case, the Bafana scenario, which I guess we're going to talk about largely holds.
So it looks like with the elective conference coming over this weekend, Ramaphosa is not going to be kicked out. Phala has not spelled the end of his presidency, and that he will then be reappointed president of the ANC and lead the party into the 2024 election. Now, many people are hopeful that we'll have change in 2024. How are you reading it?
I think that the ANC is probably going to lose its majority, maybe 47, 46, 45%. Before Phala, my forecast was 47%, which meant that it needs an alliance with one or two smaller parties to govern in coalition. So Ramaphosa stays South Africa's president until 2029. Then in 2029 is the big change in South Africa. At that point, because I think ANC decline is structural in nature, that 2029, the chances are for a coalition government to govern South Africa, an opposition coalition to govern South Africa. So Ramaphosa, I think the ANC are going to lose their majority 2024. I think they're going to be ousted in Gauteng. Gauteng support may go down to around 40%. But the big challenge, really, the big question, both in Gauteng and nationally, is where does the, let's call it the reformist wing of the ANC go? Is it able to cling to power with an alliance of smaller parties? Or is it forced to choose the EFF or the DA? And of course, that choice will be very important for South Africa. It's a choice in simplistic terms between growth, good governance, and redistribution, and all kinds of challenges that reflect in the RET faction within the ANC. And that really, so South Africa is heading for very, very critical time, first in Gauteng, and then eventually, I think, 2029 at national level.
Is it as binary as that? That you literally are going to either have a path towards prosperity or a path towards penury?
No, of course not. Scenarios are a way to think, to frame the future, and the future is always more complicated and more messy. I guess the big question remains what happens to the urban black vote. And that then comes to the issue if there is a alternative political movement that starts, and there are many efforts, there are many wannabes that can excite and mobilize the urban black vote. And that is a potential game changer. And that really is what everybody's fighting about. The other big game changer, I think, relates to the nature of the opposition. And you've basically referred to it. What the DA has done in the Western Cape, it governs it well, but it's not been able to extend that message and ethos into the rest of South Africa, and particularly in Gauteng. And it is seen as a remnant of sort of South African white politics. And unless the DA is able to change that, it remains capped in its ambitions and in its potential as a potential alliance partner. Because the ANC's instinct is towards the EFF. It sees the EFF as a breakaway child, although that has changed a little bit. And that, of course, but ideologically, the RET faction within the ANC, of course, is much closer aligned. And they are certainly not in the ascendance. I think the problem that we have in South Africa is that Ramaphosa has been faced, it's like a perfect storm. He has faced the one problem after the other. If it wasn't state capture, it was COVID. If it wasn't COVID, it is the invasion in Russia. If it's not that, it's,
Eskom.
Yeah, Eskom, which of course is entirely of the ANC's own making. And he's been battling to deal with this while trying to keep the governing party together. And it's that challenge of holding the ANC together that translates so dramatically into what we would call poor leadership, ineffectiveness, lack of action, because 80% of his time is holding the ANC together, because if the ANC splits, it of course loses power.
There is a big election. We're talking on the 13th of December today. There's a huge election tomorrow in the Ditsobotla area in the municipality where, because the ANC was in such chaos, they literally had two mayors, two municipal managers, that it had to be dissolved. Even they realized that that council had to be dissolved. Helen Zille's been on the ground there. So has John Steenhuisen from the Democratic Alliance. There are numerous, I think it's 14 parties that are going to be contesting it. Is there anything that we should be looking for in that election tomorrow, in the results of the election tomorrow, given that at the previous election in only a year ago, in the local election, the ANC got 52%, the DA and the EFF 15% roughly each. Is there anything there that'll give us a signpost towards where your scenario might be adjusted, or indeed where 2024 might have a different outcome?
Alec, not really. We've seen the elections, the by-elections go up and down. We've seen trends go in both directions. And we see, as you've referred to, the rise of, I wouldn't call them splinter parties, but a fracturing of the opposition vote. And the bar to representation in South Africa is particularly low. So whereas, and I've been in part of, there have been many delegations that have gone to Europe to look at coalition politics. The problem is that coalition politics elsewhere in the world consists of 2 or 3 parties. In South Africa, coalition politics consists of 8 or 9 parties, each one of them who thinks he has the leverage on power. And that makes coalition government in South Africa very difficult and more complicated, apart from many other factors, historical and otherwise, that relate to how to govern. So we are going through a learning curve in South Africa, and I think it's important not to look at the terrible experience we've had with coalition governments in various places in South Africa, because it is part of a learning experience, and over time it is bound to improve. But I don't think one can at the moment take these local elections really as a clear indicator of what is going to happen at the national level.
Why is that?
Because I think that what determines local elections is local politics, not national politics. That's true globally. So people vote very often for a personality, for somebody that they know, for local issues. And the party representations are very often nominal in real terms. I was recently on a trip to Germany where we looked at exactly this phenomena. And you very clearly see that what happens at the local level is really about local issues. And success is determined by the relationship, very often personal relationships between the leaders at that level. So the orientation of the leadership of the mayor and so on is often almost of a nominal value. Yes, they may in our terms be EFF, ANC, DA. The reason, but just Alex, to get back to something else that you mentioned about the binary nature, it's an important point that you make. To establish a national party, that's just a small n, in South Africa, with a national footprint requires extraordinary ability, money, organization, resources. Only the EFF have been able to do that. Every splinter from the ANC has collapsed. And why I remain largely of the view that the larger opposition parties, the DA and the EFF, will still be prominent going forward, and possibly the IFP, is exactly because of that. So you have great excitement about a new party coming. We all remember the potential that COPE had that was squandered by its leadership. So maybe that was a unique moment. But putting together a national party that, for example, I don't think that's possible for 2024 anymore. It may be possible for 2029, but that is always there's always that potential. We are seeing in other countries in Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, are two good examples where there is such a frustration with the governing party that you see mobilization around a new figure, around a new party, in the case of Nigeria, the Labour Party, that then creates a momentum. That's also what happened with Barack Obama at the time. Personality, frustration creates that momentum, but it's very difficult in South Africa. Remember that the problem is that ANC support is increasingly rural, and that is a support that is not informed by the collective bubble that you and I live in. We live in a bubble where we read and we debate and we consider what's going to happen in South Africa. It's an urban bubble. It's largely divorced from what is happening in the rural areas, which remains solidly behind the ANC. So what you will find in South Africa, similar to most other African countries, is that the power transition will happen in urban areas, but it will remain areas like Limpopo and so on will remain dominantly ANC, because people there just don't see an alternative and don't hear of an alternative.
So Ditsa those who are looking at it, the whole Lichtenburg district, for some kind of a change, or heralding some kind of a change for the future, are likely to be disappointed because it's very rural, even though it's been disastrously managed. The people in that area will just stick with what they know, perhaps.
No, we'll take that to the national level. The ANC's government has been disastrous, yet the ANC maintains national. It's got 57% at the moment. But remember the other point that I made, that local politics about local people, local issues. I don't know enough about the situation there to know how local politicians and what is happening at the local level. But that can change things. But it's not about national politics. It's not about the ANC, DA, EFF, is the point that I'm really making.
All right. Well, taking it one step further, 2024, those who are hoping to see the Rainbow Coalition, the DA and Freedom Front plus African Christian Democratic Party, and of course the IFP, and very importantly Action SA, getting to a point of 50% plus. In the scenario as you've sketched it out, there's going to have to be a big change in the trajectory for that to happen.
I don't think that's possible. Not 2024. I think the ANC will remain the majority party. It will have almost twice the support of the closest rival. So the coalition that you are speaking about, let's refer to that as a kind of a growth coalition, won't get to the 50% without the EFF. And at a national level, it's almost impossible to think of all those parties, but particularly the DA and the EFF getting together. So I don't think that it's a realistic possibility in 2024. There could, of course, be a split in the ANC. If there is a split in the ANC, then things change. If we find, for example, in the next days that leaders within the ANC that really are campaigning against Ramaphosa in Parliament vote against him or abstain, and at the end of the day, you find that the RAT faction splits off and maybe then enters into talks with the EFF or something like that, then you could find a substantial difference with what's going to happen in 2024. But that's the only scenario where I think the ANC falls far enough that it does not form the core of a governing coalition.
Jakkie, I talk to Herman Mashaba relatively often. When we spoke in the past week, he was saying they were celebrating 100 branches in Limpopo and 100 branches in Northwest Province. He now has leaders around the country. He's taking a long view, and he certainly is understanding the critical importance of the rural vote. How are you seeing the role that Action SA will play, given that their real focus has been on the urban black vote?
So in our forecasts, I think the most we give Action SA, and this is forecasts that is not done based on opinion polls. This is really looking at trends and history and so on. I think we give him 5% in 2024, which would be huge. For a party to come from nothing to get to 5%, the only party that's managed that is the EFF. So if he can manage that, that would be great. But that would be spread across South Africa. It doesn't translate into perhaps even an opposition in a particular province or into. So at a national level, bringing 5% to the table, that's significant. That places you above the IFP, Freedom Front Plus, and so on and so forth. But it's still, less than half of what EFF have, 11, 12%, a quarter of what the DA has. So it can be important. But it's a long slog, and I think that the only way to get there is through a long slog. There's no other way. But he certainly has name recognition. I think the issue around his focus and his efforts around migration have cost him a little bit. But that's, perhaps in our bubble. I think that the broader South African populace is quite xenophobic. A function of apartheid, a function of also the way in which the ANC have governed the country.
So what do we look out for going between today, with the ANC elective conference this weekend, and the election in 2024? What is going to reshape your scenario, or what is going to be the most likely signposts for us to see exactly how the scenario is going to play out?
Well, I think the first thing to watch for is exactly who votes in favor of the Section 89 report when it is debated in the National Assembly. Because
that is the Section 89?
The Section 89 report, the Pala Pala report. Are there going to be a number of ANC members of Parliament that are either going to abstain, that I expect, or perhaps even vote in favor of the report? Then even the ANC would have to take disciplinary action. The ANC, from in Fate of the Nation, I said that it stood for absolutely no consequences, and that still holds true to today. That's the first signpost. The second signpost, obviously, what happens at the ANC's elective conference. I expect lots of commentary, but that Ramaphosa will emerge as the ANC's president and as its presidential candidate. I expect that he will go into the elections 2024 and lead the country at the head of a coalition, ANC 46, 47%, until 2029. And then we will see, of course, all eyes are what's going to happen with the deputy president position. But if you believe, as I tend to, that 2029 the ANC loses power, then the deputy president position is perhaps not as important as it's made out to be. What is going to be important is what happens within the opposition parties, in particular what happens within the Democratic Alliance. Is it able to change its current image and trajectory, which has become that of a regional party? Steenhuisen is trying to change that, but it needs. I mean, Helen Zille tried that on 2 occasions, but failed, and the party. It needs a reorientation if it is to become part of a viable national coalition. And then the big issue is, will either the EFF or the DA be prepared to serve in a coalition with the ANC come 2029? Big question.
Just one last question on this, given that it is so foremost in most South Africans' minds, the disaster at Eskom. Is that likely to play a role in what happens politically in this country over the next 18 months?
Yes, it is. We've been deep in load shedding territory for how long? This is entirely a disaster of the ANC's making by their inaction and eventual action, and every day. But it's not only Eskom, it is the Zondo Commission rolling out and so on and so forth. It is crime levels. And so the ANC is struggling with the effects of its poor governance. But remember, they're at 57% at the moment. So if they go to 47, 46%, that's 10, 11 percentage points. That is a huge drop in support. And that support is basically increasingly in the rural areas, because in Gauteng, as I said, I expect that the ANC support will drop to just above 40%. And then that's the big issue. Then what happens with coalition politics? Is it possible to put together a opposition government in Gauteng, and then to see what happens with regard to particularly the relations between the DA and the EFF, given the assumption that there is no other large party, which could be Action SA in Gauteng, that makes inroads. Because I think, just responding to the other point that you make, I think the issue for Herman Mashaba and Action SA is exactly what happens in Gauteng. It's the economic and demographic heart of South Africa. And taking Gauteng changes the politics of South Africa. And an alternative argument to spreading yourself out across South Africa is to focus really on where he is strong, where Mashaba is strong, which is in Gauteng. Because if the ANC is ousted from Gauteng, then both Cape Town and Gauteng are out of the ANC's grasp, and then it's goose is cooked.
Jakkie Cilliers is the founder of the Institute of Security Studies. He's also the author of the 2017 book, Fate of the Nation, 3 Scenarios for South Africa's Future, which, as we discussed, has held up well, those scenarios. I'm Alec Hogg from BizNews.com.